Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome along once again to the ThinkTent for what promises to be a very interesting session. We have a distinguished panel to discuss the subject today: Whitehall, servant or master. And three of the people on the panel, of course, have actually been in there, in the trenches, wrestling directly with Whitehall. So that should be very interesting. My name is Mike Denham. I'm the chairman of the Taxpayers Alliance, and 50 years ago, I was a new graduate entrant into the civil service. And I well remember being called in the first few days for a sort of induction session, tea and biscuits with the permanent secretary of the department. And he sat us all down, and really it was a sort of orientation session for our careers in the civil service. And the one thing I remember him saying was that your role throughout your career is to make sure that the politicians don't do anything too crazy. And, you know, that stuck with me, and it seemed like a pretty arrogant thing to say at the time. But of course, as a civil servant, you know, in the defense, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot of criticism of the civil service today, but in defense of the civil service, you know, it is very difficult to detach your own views entirely from, let's say, a government that you don't agree with, and you know, you think you're doing the best. So these people are not all evil people, and I would say that having spent 8 years in the civil service. But I will now go on and introduce the panel, and I think we'll have an interesting discussion. On my immediate right is Lord Agnew, who was Minister of State at the Cabinet Office and HM Treasury from 2020 to 2022. He was previously Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for the School System from 2017 through to 2020. He's also served as lead non-executive board member of the Ministry of Justice, and he's been involved in a number of different government jobs over the years. I think all of you will remember that earlier this year he resigned from the Treasury on account of his concern over the fraud that has obviously taken place in some of the COVID support measures, and his frustration, and he'll speak for himself, at the fact that the Treasury didn't seem to take it quite as seriously as perhaps they should have done. On my far left is Nikki DaCosta, who's Specialist Partner at Flint Global and served as Director of Legislative Affairs in Number 10 for two Prime Ministers, Theresa May and Boris Johnson. She was responsible for delivering the government's legislative programme. She helped chart a way through difficult cross-Whitehall issues, as well as break the parliamentary deadlock on Brexit to secure a general election. On my immediate left is Lord Maud, who you will all know, Francis Maud, MP for Horsham from 1997 to 2015, off to the House of Lords after the election of that year, previously Minister of State for Trade and Investment, Paymaster General. I think for the purposes of this discussion, the important thing about Francis Maud's background, of course, is that he was in the Cabinet Office for many years under David Cameron, trying to make the public sector, and in particular Whitehall, operate more efficiently and cut out waste. And I think he was quite successful, or his area was quite successful, in saving taxpayers billions of pounds through that programme. And finally, we have Dr. Catherine Haddon, who is a Senior Fellow at the Institute of Government, where she leads work on changes in government ministers and the workings of the Constitution. Before joining the Institute for Government, Catherine was a lecturer on security and intelligence history. So perhaps you'd like to join with me in welcoming our panel. Okay, well, we're going to start by asking Lord Agnew to set out his experiences and his thoughts on this question of who is the servant, who's the master.
Thank you very much, Mike. Can you hear me okay? Great. Well, we were asked to answer 4 questions in the summary, so in the few minutes I've got, I thought I'd just try and do that. So the first question is, who runs the country? The short answer is, of course, the politicians will try to on the big issues, but on the everyday issues, they definitely do not run the country. The civil service runs the country. So I can give you a couple of very small examples, because the devil is always in the detail with this stuff. But if we take the failure of the Passport Office a few months ago to get on top of passport renewals, That was not a ministerial failure. If there is any organisation in government that has the data on passports, when their expiry dates are due, who uses their passport a lot, you would have thought it was in their competence to have ensured that they anticipated the huge surge in travel that had been bottled up because of COVID. I can take another more recent example, which is literally hot off the press, which is the result of an HR court case. It's something, this is quite a minuscule thing, but the impact is extremely negative. It's called the Harper Trust versus Brazel. It's all about a music teacher who claimed that she deserved a lot more holiday pay. Anyway, go through the whole process. It went to the Supreme Court. They won in the court. The government has now, officials have now put this into regulations, and it basically means that the holiday pay for someone working 30 hours a year goes from £34 to £537. So if you take an educational organisation such as the trust that I run, the Academy Trust I set up 10 years ago, that will put a bill of $200,000 a year on to my staff, just like that, 10 times more holiday pay. Now, that wasn't, no minister made that decision, but that's what's happened. So then we move to then the other question is, well, why aren't ministers more on top of things? So if I just explain my own remit, I was the Minister for Civil Service HR, Government Digital, Government Property, Project Speed to accelerate infrastructure, and then thrown into the mix was HMRC border readiness for Brexit. So how many balls in the air can you actually keep? And as a Lords Minister, I'm lucky that I didn't have a constituency to have to go back to every weekend. I lived 5 minutes from Whitehall when I was in London. I had a supportive wife, and my children are grown up. You know, there are only so many hours in a day, and eventually you go mad if you don't get some balance. So that's why I think the civil servants run the country. Is the civil service too big? The short answer is yes. We know that the figure that's been bandied around is that there have been 90,000 more added since Brexit. Now, that figure is slightly disingenuous because that does include important additional people such as prison officers. But there are certainly 60,000 extra civil servants doing jobs which I don't think need to be done. And they've just crept in because the civil service itself is very keen to grow itself. It is as simple as that. And as soon as ministers lose attention, which is what happened with all of the imbroglio of the Brexit, then they come in droves, and that's what's happened. I mean, if you take the Department for Health, which is nothing to do with the NHS, they have something like 5,000 civil servants, and all they do is talk to each other. I mean, let's be honest, they haven't solved the problems in the NHS over the last 10 years. So how do we get a grip? And I think there's a very simple way to do this, actually, which is literally two sentences, which is to demand far more accountability from the permanent secretaries. These are the gods that sit at the top. There are only about 50 of them. And a huge achievement by Francis, my predecessor in part of my role, was to take life tenure from them. So they only have a 5-year tenure, and it does not have to be automatically renewed. But politicians have failed to use that mechanism over the last 8 or so years and use it to drive the mandate that they want from the government of the day. Now, one very interesting thing happened when I was in the Cabinet Office. The Cabinet Secretary, Mr. Case, brought in a situation where he wanted to sit down with each permanent secretary 3 times a year and go through their priorities, which I said to him when he announced this to me was the most exciting thing I'd heard since I'd come into government. He thought I was being sarcastic, but I wasn't, because it is that accountability that matters. I then said, well, can I come and join you in those meetings? Well, there was a deathly hush on that. So these meetings are happening, but they're not accountable enough. So the last thing is asked is, will this government get a grip of it? And the answer I can say to that is I hope so, I really hope so, because if they are going to try and balance the books over the next couple of years, the free hit is from the inefficiencies in government. And very simple number, it's probably about 35 billion a year without taking away anything from the front line. But the problem with it is it takes agonizing attention to detail and staying power. And that is the thing which, with great respect to a lot of politicians, they're not terribly good at. I'll give you one tiny example. I discovered when I was, as I said, I was in charge of civil service HR, I discovered that the training regime was not fit for purpose. I asked for the budget. I asked for that in August 2020. I got the answer in January 2022. The answer was it's somewhere between 150 million and 600 million a year. We don't know how much it is. We don't know how the money is spent, and we don't know how effectively it's spent. So that was great. But at the time, I said, well, we're going to remove macro aggression training from civil service training. Apparently that was the most popular course. I don't quite know how it helps anybody, but there we are. Anyway, I started that that in September of 2020. It was finally achieved in the last week of Jacob Rees-Mogg before he left his job a few weeks ago. So it took 2 years just to take that tiny thing out of the system. So that is why I think there is a huge challenge, but the win is there, and I think this government is probably just waking up to the potential. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you very much, Lord Agnew. Nikki, would you like to pick it up?
I hope everyone will excuse my voice. It's on the way out or maybe coming back. I thought I would start by saying, you know, I entered government in 2017. And I want to take you into the room with a senior civil servant who was my mentor. And he was the principal private secretary to the government chief whip. I'd known him for about 10 years. And he sat me down and he said, listen, the system will drown you in paper from day one unless you are a player. And then he took me through who was a player in number 10 and who was not. I will not disclose who is not. And he was very scathing. But that was the view from within the civil service. And so when we talk about the blob, you know, and I was looking at the slogans of it crawls, it creeps, it eats you alive. This is the fact. It weighs against you. And by that I mean the body of it. It's not a person. It's not malicious. It's not even really particularly sentient. And I don't mean that as a criticism of the individuals. It is because we talk about the system, the machine that you have to fight, because often it is just running on autopilot, the code that was last fed to it by a minister or an official, or maybe just by a senior civil servant. And that is demoralizing and demotivating, whether you're a minister, whether you're an advisor, or whether you're an official, and you get worn down. And I thrived on it. I did enjoy, you know, the fight. But these are the complaints I heard from senior civil servants and officials in general of cabinet office nepotism. You were either in the circle or outside of it. That nobody looked after your progression. If you, for example, in my sphere, if you were a legislative expert in the civil service, nobody cared to think about where to place you in the past. So no matter how long you'd served, for example, in the Parliamentary and Business Legislation Committee, you just didn't matter after that. So you lose a lot of expertise. I have a very good colleague at the moment who said he left the service because nobody could find him enough work to occupy him for more than 60% of his day. And that was just not something he was up for. There was other people that worked every day for 6 months and every weekend in the pandemic, and there was no ability for their senior managers to reward them or to make any exceptions to say, well done for that job. And the ineffective stayed in post. The bullies were moved on and often promoted. This is a place, it's a blob because nobody leaves. And in business, I remember running an agency, and the decision I didn't take fast enough was to get rid of somebody that had led to a really negative impact on the team. And the weight of that I left on them too long is a weight left on all those civil service colleagues because we don't address quality and whether you're good at your job. So when I say we critique the civil service, the problem is it can feel to the individuals involved that it's a critique of them, of often very excellent civil servants. And it's not, it's about the system as a whole. But we've got to be wary. When we make those big calls and we say we've got to chop this out, it impacts motivation, and it's the good people that leave. They get the message and go, well, I'm off, and what we end up, we hit our head count, but we're left with the people we didn't actually want. And so 5 suggestions. First, you need a plan of action, and thankfully we have Lord Maud, But you also need the senior civil service to buy into it for the longevity, because I think you're talking a minimum of 5 years to make progress. And you see it in different departments where you have, for example, in DCMS and Sarah Healy, she's attracted some really good people. You saw it on Michael Gove as well when he was in charge of DEFRA. Suddenly DEFRA sucked in a ridiculously number of good people despite it being DEFRA in sort of civil service terms. And so if you know where the good people are, they know, and they've got to look at each team and say, who are your good people? Let's get on with that. The third thing is you've got, and I'm just reading, you've got to be absolutely clear with the civil service on what is and isn't acceptable. There is, and forgive me, Kath, but you know, whether you're the Hansard Society Institute for Government or the Constitution Unit at UCL, or you're in the civil service, there's sometimes a belief that you're neutral in opposing the government and just saying you're wrong, and this has led to politicization. And so there needs to be carefulness, and that's exacerbated by having former perm sex, former cab sex in the Lords, and them speaking, and it goes from there. So restate what is the purpose of the civil service. Say what is acceptable. Tackle woke culture. But the fourth thing is that the stick will not work alone. High-performing businesses, the ratio of praise to criticism is 5 to 1. So you must single out the people that are succeeding. You must praise them. Let the departments know. Show them. Exemplify these individuals. And finally, one thing, we need to make sure that as politicos, we do not undermine a culture where it should be about meritocracy. And I fear that what has happened at the top of the civil service has demoralized the civil service, because if the permanent secretaries, and you know, I have a so I'm just thinking about this as, you know, going out publicly. You know, I have great respect for Simon Case, but the way of the appointments have been handled for Mark Sedgwill and for Simon Case, I understand, according to civil servants, undermine the belief that they can get to the top without that political intervention, and that has a problem then for the leadership of the service. So I'm unashamedly pro the civil service. I've sort of had some excellent officials, but we need to think about the whole piece, and those are my top thoughts.
Thank you very much, Nikki. I'm now going to ask Catherine to give us her thoughts.
Okay. Francis can sum us all up then. Thanks for that. I'm not going to. I'm going to respond to a few of the points you've already made, because otherwise you'll just get multiple different sort of agendas for change. And one of the biggest problems that I find is that we keep going round and round the same agendas for change. And Francis will talk about this in a minute, but I'm a historian of civil service reform, and you can go back, you know, to the Fulton reports in 1968 and find pretty much the same issues that we're looking at now. You can actually go back to 1918 and find reports there, and you can go back to the Northcote Trevelyan report and see, you know, some of the similar issues that we're talking about. So this is a very long issue of problems. And just to reinforce what Nikki said, this is not an issue that civil servants aren't aware of. I don't think I've ever done a talk with civil servants where you haven't got huge frustrations from them, whether it's about the kind of things that we're talking about, whether it's about the sort of culture which still feels to a lot of people very Oxbridgey. You don't get diversity of thought, you don't get, you know, diversity from around the country. So you're not getting in sort of different perspectives which can challenge, you know, which I wouldn't say, it's not just, we talked about this with Baroness Stoll yesterday, it's not just about the sort of neutrality thing, it's also about a sort of homogenous mindset. You know, we've obviously been hearing a lot about Treasury orthodoxy. There's good arguments for when you need challenge and, you know, the sort of expertise of organisations and so forth. But it's not at all wrong to say that you want to challenge orthodoxy and you want to start seeing fresh ideas, diversity of thought and so forth. So all of these themes are something that I think you see again and again, and there's lots of different things that we need to fix with the civil service. And I would say it's not just the civil service, it is a system of government, because it's not just those people who are officials, it is the way in which the whole system works. And I think, as Lord Agnew says, some of that stems from the fact that you have got a very small proportional number of ministers where the whole system needs them to be able to, you know, agree decisions, pass paper, deal with the bureaucracy and so forth. And I think we're still dealing with a 19th century system of submissions, red boxes, all this kind of bureaucracy, that surely there are more innovative ways in which we can do it. But anyway, the thing that I would say that we need to deal with, which is at the heart of this, is churn in the civil service and the lack of institutional memory, because you can see that all over the place as being one of the sort of crucial problems that they have. People move on with jobs. You can get statistics on the Treasury where sort of 25% of the department is moving in or out of it every year. It's a very young department. Great, intellectual people, very vibrant place, attracts good people, but they often move on. My biggest bugbear is I do a lot around institutional memory and, government having an idea about past policies and not necessarily reinventing the wheel every time some new policy teams come to a problem that actually a minister who has sometimes been there longer knows more about the history of it. But whenever I talk about this issue of institutional memory, it's because somebody from the Cabinet Office, a new person, every 2 years comes and says, I've been tasked with looking at institutional memory. And they start from the beginning. And Francis, you will know, you were a different person, a minister, doing this because you stayed. But the Cabinet Office has a new team doing civil service reform every sort of 2 to 3 years. And that is frustrating as well, because it means that they then come to it afresh and they're discovering for the first time, reading the Haldane report, starting to sort of put all of these together, and you get a new document. And as Gillian Keegan said in one of our events yesterday on a different matter, policy without delivery is just paper. And the same is true of civil service reform. Civil service reform, just as a policy, it's just a piece of paper. It doesn't mean anything. All of the work has to be on delivery. And stopping the sort of churn of people doing civil service reform would at least be one start to deal with the very long-term issues that we all agree exist in terms of how to fix the government system. Anyway, that's my rant. But I'm also pro-civil servants, Institute for Government. I think, you won't meet anyone who doesn't feel the same way about the frustrations that we're all going to talk about today.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And finally, Francis.
Well, look, picking up, I think a lot of this has been covered very eloquently. But starting point is I think we have some fantastic civil servants, but we don't make the best of them. And we don't make life easy for them. And it is often said, and I have found this in the review I'm currently undertaking for the government of civil service governance and accountability. When I've talked to civil servants, what I hear is a lot of criticism of the civil service. And the civil service as a system, as a machine, is broken. Not my words, actually. There have been several former officials, distinguished officials, who have written and spoken about this in the last couple of years. Just earlier this year, Jonathan Slater, a previous permanent secretary, wrote a piece called Fixing Whitehall's Broken Policy Machine. It's very punchy indeed, and makes some very telling criticisms. So I think we have some fantastic civil servants, and they're made to work in a system that is fundamentally quite broken, but is mendable. And pick up Kath's point as well, this is actually about a system of government as well. One of the things that's clear to me is that when we complain about the civil service not being accountable, too often we appoint ministers who aren't prepared well enough for what they've been asked to do and don't frankly know enough about how to hold the people who work for them accountable. And one of the things I was very glad to see in the Gove Declaration on Government Reform last year, published in the name of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet Secretary, was a commitment to improve the training and the preparation of ministers. We need to take this much more seriously. Instead of just someone randomly being plucked from the backbenches and told, tomorrow morning you are going to be sitting at a desk in X department, and you seem to be a reasonably bright person, and I'm sure you'll pick it up. That's not a way to run a successful government. So we should be much more rigorous within the parties, about preparing people to be ministers in advance of them being appointed, and then supporting them much more in how you do the job. And part of it is telling them what they can do. Quite often, what ministers, they're often told what they can't do by civil servants. And what I say to new ministers is, 9 times out of 10, you'll be confronted with what looks like a brick wall, but it's made of paper and you can walk through it. The 10th time, it will be something you can't do. But the question the 4 words most frequently heard in your office should be, show me the chapter and verse. Show me where it says, I can't do this. Because actually the powers that ministers have, but too often don't use, is a well-kept secret. So I'm doing this review at the moment on accountability and authority and governance in the civil service. And of course, the first starting point is, in any successful organization, accountability and authority should be aligned. And there's one very broad sense in which there's a problem, which is that ministers have a pretty much undiluted accountability for what happens in their department, and they have reasonable authority over the financial resources, but severely truncated authority over the human resources, the people, your ability, if someone's not doing what you want, to replace them, as you would do running a business with someone who can do it. And that issue is fraught with concerns about politicization and civil service impartiality, and it's very well-trodden ground, and I think there are some things that can be done to improve it very considerably. But actually, what has seized me doing the work on this review and the reading back and talking to people is, and Kath picked up on this point, is when you read the history of civil service reform, it's déjà vu all over again. You're constantly reading the same things, the same issues being highlighted, the same failings, and they don't get resolved. You go back, as Kath said, you can go back to the 19th century, but the Haldane Report in 1918, the discussions, the debate after the Second World War, the Fulton Report, going right through to what Kate Bingham said in her lecture late last year, and the lectures by Sir John Kingman, former Second Permanent Secretary of the Treasury, Jonathan Slater. You're reading and hearing about the same things over and over again. And why doesn't it? And these aren't things which are contentious. They're not things which are controversial. You know, the point about churn, civil servants being randomly, in an uncontrolled way, moving from one post to another, regardless of the business need or the effect on continuity. The over-reliance on generalists, the lack of specialist, technical, deep knowledge, which contributes to the lack of institutional memory. The gap between people writing policy in Whitehall and the people who are charged with implementation. So you write a beautiful policy, you chuck it over the wall at people who are responsible for implementation. And if they say, well, actually, this is not capable of being effectively implemented, the people around the minister are the policy people. And so that needs to be much closer together. The imperviousness, this sort of carapace which exists around particularly the Whitehall part of civil service, where the civil service culturally doesn't value experience gained from outside. So bright civil servants who would like to go out and spend some time doing something in the private sector, earn some money at higher rates, and then come back, they feel, and they're right, that the experience they gain doing something outside will not be valued when they come back in. And people who come in from outside as external hires, too often they feel like country members of the club. Sir Peter Gershon, when he came in as a very distinguished businessman into Whitehall to lead some work on efficiency under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, he described the experience. He said, when you arrive in Whitehall, you find out all the decisions are taken in the civil service behind a wall, and you wander around looking for a door, and eventually you'll find a door, but then you find it only opens from the inside. And that's that carapace of imperviousness. And this has been identified time and time again, and yet it hasn't been addressed. The failings of management information. 10 years ago, I persuaded Martin Reed, very distinguished businessman, to do a report on management information to get common definitions and standards across Whitehall so you could do some proper benchmarking and actually have some consistency so you could plot trends in management information over time. Starting this review, I talked to the government's now lead non-exec, and he says, well, I'm trying to start some work on looking at common standards for management information across the piece. I said, well, they've shown you the Martin Reed report from 10 years ago. No, never heard of it. Failure of institutional memory, may be deliberate, may be accidental, maybe short memories, but that's just an indication. On the imperviousness, the carapace, again, identified time and time again the lack of parity of esteem between insiders versus outsiders who come in, and between those who do policy, the Whitehall mandarinate who are treated a bit like sort of white collar versus blue collar. People who do implementation, finance, IT, operational delivery, they're sort of blue collar, below the salt. And the white collar mandarins even get a special kind of honor. They get companions of the bath. And if you do the less glamorous stuff, then you get a lesser, or what seems like a less elite form of. So these signals hugely matter. And then Nick's point that nobody leaves. High-performing organizations, all militaries that I know of, all high-performing corporates, operate an up or out culture. No bureaucracy does. And this is where people have outlived their ability to make a positive contribution, and they are kindly, generously, and encouraged to leave and do something else. And there's no stigma attached to it. It's not telling them they're worthless people. It's just saying, you're now at a position where there isn't a future for you in this organization, but there are lots of things for you to do in other places. And that's actually a compassionate thing to do for people, because nothing more frustrating than people being stuck there. And of course, we're all familiar with the old joke, except it isn't really a joke. For every one person in government trying to make something happen, there are 10 trying to stop it. And I was relayed this to a senior civil servant in another country, in another government, and he said, only 10? And that's because the people who've outlived, have exhausted their ability to make a positive contribution, because they're basically good people who want to feel they're contributing, they make a negative contribution. So that's what creates the tendency in government, which people complain, senior civil servants themselves complain about it, the tendency for things constantly to be reopened. Decisions that you think have been taken, they get reopened, more facts, more data, more evidence, more meetings, set up a committee to look at it, to delay, obstruct, question, and that's part of the problem. So there are a whole lot of things. So how do you make this happen? How do you make these reforms happen? First of all, you need someone in charge. And the head of the civil service has, as long as I can remember, been a side hustle for someone doing another job, cabinet secretary, head of the treasury, in my time, head of the CLG department. The only time there was a dedicated head of the civil service 40 years ago, the permanent secretary in charge of the civil service department, part of the responsibility for the civil service rested with, yes, the treasury. So actually even that head of the civil service didn't have undiluted authority. And even if he did have authority, it wouldn't have been operated over the whole of the civil service, because it isn't one civil service, except when it suits it to be one civil service. And too often it's departmental, and the things which I started to do, which Theo heroically took forward, of creating the functional model where the cross-cutting functions, which are recognizably the same wherever you find them in government, would be strongly led from the center of government, with things like the Crown Commercial Service, the government digital service, which was world leading when we set it up. And these require there to be authority exercised from the centre over the whole civil service, but there isn't anyone who has that authority. And if there were such a person, there is no one actually to hold them accountable. The textbook answer would be, well, ministers will hold them accountable, but actually, in reality, ministers won't be able to, for all the reasons Theo and I know, and we were some of the ones who actually tried to do this, because we tend not to be there for long enough. I was there much longer than most, and deeply frustrated by how hard it is to do it. And so you need this to be bipartisan. You need both sides of the aisle, both the current government and any future government, to be bought into the need to have a longer perspective. And you need there to be an external authority which has the power to hold to account an individual who has responsibility for driving that change, that continuous improvement. Quickly on your question, is the civil service too big? The IFG published this graph which shows the fall in the size of the civil service, like for like, by 21% between 2010 and 2015, and how the graph has risen to almost exactly the same level since 2015. I'm not conscious that it's doing 25% more than it was in 2015. Is there scope to have a much smaller civil service? Absolutely. Would that enable people to be better paid within the civil service? Well, very possibly, actually, and still make a saving, a financial saving overall. So there are trade-offs here. That's probably enough of my continued therapy to be going on with.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Francis. I mean, I'm going to open it to questions in a moment. I think, what strikes me from this is this repeated point that, we've been around these loops many times before, and it's so familiar to me from my experience 50 years ago. It sounds exactly the same. The other thing is, the one question I wanted to ask, whether anyone's got a quick thought on this, is, has any democracy around the world got this right? I mean, I've heard it suggested actually in the ThinkTent here this afternoon that, what we should do is follow more of an American model where we introduce more political appointments at the top of the civil service to try and make the thing work. Catherine, you obviously look at these systems around the world. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that goes partly to Nikki's point earlier about you would have a very different system where meritocracy is not, is subsumed to the sort of political appointments. It also undermines the other thing that we were talking about in terms of institutional memory. You can look back at the American system. They have 3 months preparing for government, but it's still, with all the appointment processes, it can take them 2 years to get up and running. And then obviously they're into midterms, and then they're looking at the next presidential election. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily a better system, and you're also looking at a federal approach. What we could do, though, is start thinking about the support for ministers that the civil service and special advisors provide, and actually get a little bit, less overly concerned about caps on the numbers of special advisors, because most civil servants love special advisors. They make their jobs easier. They can find out what the minister thinks without having to trouble the ministers. Red boxes are far too big for any minister to get through. You shouldn't have people making these incredibly important decisions having to work till 2 a.m. every night in order to get through all the paperwork. I mean, you need to revisit the paperwork as well, but you shouldn't have to have a system that is reliant on that. And we do get a bit obsessed about this idea of you shouldn't have too many special advisors because what will go horribly wrong. I don't think it would undermine the system to increase it somewhat. And I think there's more that you can do to think about how we deliver. The Thatcher government was responsible for the Next Steps reforms. The idea interestingly, the idea was that you would create more and more executive agencies so that you would push out delivery. It led to the problems that Francis talked about, that it meant that there was a divorce between people who had expertise out there of delivering policies and then the people designing the policies. But also, they never did the other half of it, which was to push people out in order to actually reform and improve the centre. So it was a kind of half-done reform. But you can think about that, but it goes back to the accountability problem, because We all want this idea of decentralisation where, you know, the people who are actually responsible for doing the job are the ones held accountable. But we also want a democratic system where ministers have control and sight of things, and when things go wrong, it is still ministers that not just the media but also the public look to. And so you need to do something to think about the political culture to enable a more decentralised model if that's what you wanted.
Okay, well, let's throw it open to questions. Gentleman in the middle here with the striped shirt.
Thank you very much. Ian Bocking from Gosport. Dr. Haddon was mentioning about deliveries and deliverables. Lord Maud was talking about handing things over the fence. Do you have defined failure criteria? If it fails, this is your fault. This is what you've got to deliver. If you don't, you're a failure. It's a failure.
Francis?
Well, I mean, a good culture is one where people are encouraged to challenge, but required to take personal responsibility. That's the optimal culture. The civil service culture is almost the exact inverse of that, where it's very hard to find people who will take responsibility. Documents are always prepared as in the passive sense. It is recommended, not I recommend. There's very little taking of personal responsibility. One of the things that Jonathan Slater recommends in his paper is that policy advice should be published, maybe with a time lag, and there would be an element of accountability that brings. But having personal responsibility in a much more clearly identifiable way, not for the purposes of blame, but people actually like to have responsibilities. And they don't generally much like feeling they're sort of a faceless cog in a huge machine. And people get satisfaction from making things happen. And when they make things happen, which we hope will be successfully, they should get credit for it. But when there's this culture of it's a much more amorphous thing, then that's hard to do.
Well, I think Lord Agnew's probably got a view on this as well.
Yes, I think just to give you some reassurance that we're creeping forward a little bit. There is a thing now called the Infrastructure Projects Authority, which looks over the largest infrastructure that's in train, and we were able to force through, with a lot of reluctance from the Treasury, the fact that they could now formally stop a project. So if it went into a red rating, the IPA could say, that's it, it's all over. And that has to happen. There has to be accountability. We need a lot more of it, as Francis has said, but we are at the bottom of the mountain, hopefully going up.
Okay, another question? Right at the back there, gentleman with the beard.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm Benjamin Barnard. I work at Policy Exchange. I thought I'd just ask two quick questions because I've got to run and catch a train. The first is about the role of ministers in driving through civil service reform. We keep being told that the same things have been there for 70 years. Surely that means it's wholly in the Mandarin's gift to make happen. And why hasn't that happened before? Particularly if we keep talking about things like institutional memory. The second question is about the role of the Treasury. So when we were fighting economic orthodoxy during the campaign, one of the things we were told was that the Treasury would have to have much less power over how departments spend their budgets and try and encourage capability there. Surely there's a mild irony in the Truss government now, if we are going to introduce spending cuts, increasing the power of the Treasury. And is it time to sort of, split up the Treasury into sort of an Office of Budget Management that takes into account the corporate functions? Thank you so much.
Nikki, do you have a thought on that?
Yes. First, to the first question, yes, it's down to the Mandarins, and I think it depends on, again, the individuals wanting to make it happen, but also being in place long enough as permanent secretaries to go, right, I'm going to make this department the bee's knees in Whitehall, and I want everyone else to envy it. But that's got to be about, you've got to get the right people there. I was horrified recently to be told by a civil servant at Bayes that she had been, I've got to be careful, but no, I'm going to, sorry, it might reveal the source. On HMT Power, Look, ultimately, it's actually about politics, about the role of the Treasury. So, Treasury is good at saying no, but that's largely because it's empowered to do so. So, again, I come back a little bit down to it's how you run your government. So I think more can be done there without necessarily a big institutional change. But Francis will be more au fait at this.
Well, look, I mean, is it in the power of the heads of the civil service? Yes. I mean, Sir John Kingman, in his excellent lecture, said exactly that. He went through this list of long recognized and failings. He said, it is within the power of Whitehall to solve these. But it's hard to do it because, as I say, the head of the civil service doesn't have authority. And, we got this ludicrous thing where, making all these changes happen is a massive change management program. And, it is, I suppose, theoretically possible that you will find in the same person somebody who is the best person to be the Prime Minister's principal policy advisor and who is also capable of running the biggest change management program in the country. But it's pretty unlikely, particularly if you're expecting both of them to be done on a part-time basis. So this is just an absurd position to be in. What was the second one was on
Role of the Treasury.
Treasury, yeah. Well, look, I mean, this has been long debated. Tony Blair famously wanted to do this, and I hear a lot of talk about the Treasury having really slightly stopped being an economics ministry. And being purely a finance ministry, and I don't think they do the finance ministry bit very well anymore. There is no real-time accountability for how the money is spent. We worship at the altar of the 19th century theology of accounting officers having a direct line of accountability to Parliament, which is, of course, very important, but it all works in arrears. It's all way after the event, way after the horses have bolted. And what we introduced in the coalition government, in which Theo continued to drive, was a series of spend controls, working through this functional model, where we were able to control how the money was being spent in real time, and to get clear real-time visibility on what the money was being spent on and what it was buying. And it was by dint of these measures that we actually saved, in the course of those 5 years of the coalition government, we saved £52 billion from the running costs of government, the overhead of government. That was cumulatively, adding each year's savings to the last. But by the end of the last year, we were saving, compared with Labour's last year, £20 billion. And these were savings which not only had no adverse impact on the citizen in terms of the services they received, actually involved improving the services, because we did this big digital transformation program which massively improved the way in which a lot of public services were actually being delivered while saving shed loads of money. So it can be done, but it doesn't happen spontaneously.
Okay, I think there's a question here at the front. Gentleman here. Hang on, wait for the mic. Brian Weller.
Oh, thank you. Hello, my name is Brian Weller. I was just wondering, you get inundated with too much reading reports. Can we institute a word limit to their reports to make them more concise, brief? And also, how centralised can we make the hiring and firing of the departments under the minister?
Well, I mean, word limits, I mean, some ministers do. I mean, Michael Heseltine famously said, I want no more than one side of a sheet of paper. Norman Tebbit did something similar. You can do that. But also you need to have good junior ministers and use them well. I mean, when I was a junior minister in the Thatcher years, I had great bosses who trusted me and who simply said, I do not want to see anything in Francis's area of responsibility that hasn't been seen by Francis. And that was hugely empowering for me and made their work, because luckily they seemed to mistakenly trust me not to screw it up, But that meant the workload of the Secretary of State was lessened as a result of that. Civil servants don't like that because it enables them to game. Without that, they can game between the junior minister and the minister in charge. But there are ways of making these things work better.
But
Centralised hiring and firing, well...
Well, again, you can have. I mean, ministers can. Again, there's something I'm going to be spending some time looking at. Is actually exactly how the appointment of civil servants works at the moment. At the moment, there are very elaborate processes and procedures which if you do want to bring someone in from outside, it takes forever and deters a lot of people. You're bringing someone in from outside, they're very likely to be coming in on a pay cut, and you make them feel like they're going through an intense competition in order to be paid less. Well, that's not likely to be fantastically successful. So, and people who worked at the heart of the activity on COVID tell me that they only got things done by breaking the rules, by ignoring the rules. So maybe a possibility would be to change the rules, but that hasn't happened.
Catherine, you wanted to add something on
Yeah,
that.
it slightly goes back to the question before about Treasury and Treasury control. This all goes back to sort of 1919 when the head of the civil service was the permanent secretary at the Treasury. That's when you first have that post. And a lot of the sort of Treasury orthodoxy is around this concept of Treasury control, which very, very, very crudely means that the Treasury think that the only way to stop government expenditure, particularly departments, sort of bureaucracy growing, is to just keep, like, default saying no. And that is one of the reasons why they have retained since 1919 some control over the management of the civil service, even when the civil service department was created, because the Treasury have this sort of root ideological belief that if they don't have some kind of control over what departments are doing, then it will just sort of run away with it. And the question about sort of centralising HR, it's slightly a sort of market attitude towards it, that each department needs to have its own approach to recruitment because they're looking at different people, they've got different demands, they sort of develop them in different ways. It causes massive problems when there's machinery of government changes. But actually ministers are just as responsible for why that doesn't change, because ministers, secretaries of state, it is their departments. And the reason why one civil service often falls down is because we have cabinet government. And it is sometimes ministers as much as civil servants, permanent secretaries, who are resisting the idea of over-centralisation. Because also we've tried that a few times and it hasn't worked. I'm sounding very cynical about we've tried it all before. We haven't. There are things we can still do.
Good. Gentleman here at the front.
It's on, okay. I spent a lot of time trying to work out how to get more finance to small businesses. I work very closely with Bays and the British Business Bank, and the civil servants there are amazing. They work really hard. They're up till 2 in the morning helping me, and they're completely convinced this is right. And then it gets to Treasury, and they just put their no hat on, and they just say, this doesn't happen. We remember somebody told us that small businesses don't need any money and that there isn't a problem. Nobody can remember who said it. It's a bit like Concord. They put it together, they do so many things, and they can't remember exactly how it all works. So it's incredibly frustrating, and it sort of feels like it needs to change. I'm just wondering, is there a mechanism by which we can judge the performance of the Treasury? Are there international comparisons? Is there something we can do so they actually start to perform?
Right, I'm going to ask Lord Agnew to have a go at that one.
Well, you're right. The no hat is on all the time, and it ridiculous micromanagement of individual government departments' budgets and infantilisation. That's what happens. So the answer, in my view, at the moment they're saying, well, the Treasury now needs to be a growth ministry, but it's a bit like me asking you to come back with me to my farm tonight and do a crop plan. It is completely alien to the vast majority of Treasury officials. So I believe strongly that they should take out growth from the Treasury, a small team. It doesn't need to be more than the OBR, 50 people perhaps, who will have the remit to always look at the growth agenda behind any spending plans. And I hope that that realisation will come about when they see the Treasury is not capable of doing what it's being asked to do at the moment.
If I could just chip in a question there, Lord Agnew. I mean, the problems that you expose very clearly on the loans and the financial support through COVID and the fraud that happened there, was that the manifestation of a systemic problem, or was it simply because they were just shoveling money out of the door far too quickly?
Well, no, there was an arrogance in the Treasury that they thought they understood the risks of fraud in lending, which they didn't have a clue about. They had nobody in fraud at all in the Treasury. But they ignored the counter-fraud office, which sits in the Cabinet Office, who have deep expertise. So I find this with a lot of very clever people. If you all your life have been told how clever you are, you don't actually ever talk to ordinary people to get their views who actually have some common sense. And there's a lot of very clever people in the Treasury, but the average age is 29. Average, 20% turnover every year, average tenure, 2.5 years. Back to the point of institutional memory. They're decent, bright people, but the system doesn't require them to take soundings from people who actually have lived and got the scars on their backs.
No, okay.
And I've got to say that when we were in the coalition government running this big efficiency program, which I say saved tens of billions of pounds of taxpayers' money, the Treasury were at best indifferent to this and at worst actively hostile, which absolutely I still can't work out what their problem was. We were saving money. We were ensuring taxpayers' money, and that's what a finance ministry is meant to be there to do. I don't know whether it was they are embarrassed that we came along, swanned in, and swept a lot of money off the table, actually illustrated what they should have been doing all of this time, or what it was. But there was this deep hostility to what we were doing, and still is.
Well, you were poking your nose into their business, Francis.
Yeah, and doing it better than they were.
Right. I think we've got quite time for one more question. Gentleman there, yes, you. Yep, you.
You've spoken about how MPs that are thrust into ministerial jobs need to be trained so they can go about those jobs the best way. So I was talking to Lord Moore, by the way, but the questions generally. And do you think that the permanent secretaries are well equipped to do their jobs? They oversee some of those complex and the largest institutions in the country. They spend about 40% of GDP. And would some of these permanent secretaries be appointed as CEOs of huge companies like BAE Systems and stuff? And with ministers coming in and out of jobs as quickly as they do, would a more CEO-like figure in these departments that were equipped in the way that they are already in the private sector sort of help that, create stability and efficiency?
No, they're not remotely prepared and equipped for it. And often they fail. And actually, it is at least as much the responsibility of those who appointed them, because they appointed them without preparing them. I made a decision that all the tier of permanent secretaries, the 10 or so who are likely to have a 10-year horizon ahead of them, we should put them through top leadership programs at the world's top business schools, Stanford, Harvard, INSEAD, whatever. 3-month courses, and I had so much resistance from the then head of the civil service. It'll cost, these courses, do you realize they cost $70,000? The Daily Mail will make hay with that. I said, bring that argument on. These are people we're putting in charge of budgets of tens of billions of pounds and spending $70,000 to get them equipped, better equipped to be able to do it. Doesn't seem a bad investment to me. I eventually ground down the opposition from the civil service, and then it simply didn't happen. I mean, it just didn't happen. It's a bit like when Tony Blair announced in 2004 that in future all senior civil service appointments would be made for a 4-year fixed term. And this was meant to increase accountability and increase a focus on implementation. And nobody held the head of the civil service accountable for it, and it didn't happen. It didn't, I mean, it was kind of rich irony in this. And again, I could not work out why there was such resistance to us making this modest investment, but with, I've seen people go through these programs, these 3-month programs, and come back transformed, bigger people, more confident, more knowledgeable, with a network of, in a peer group from other sectors, which makes them more capable people. And it just, we could not make it happen. And by the time the election happened, by which time 10 of them should have done 3 months each at Harvard and Stanford, one of them, my own permanent secretary, had done 1 week at IMD in Lausanne. And he said, Francis, it was fine, but it wasn't what you had in mind. And again, why was there this resistance to it? I think it was part of protecting this sort of carapace around the civil service and removing the possibility of people being compared with a peer group from outside. But it's such a shame, such a waste of opportunity.
Well, thank you very much to the panel. I don't know about the rest of you, but it'd be very easy to leave this session feeling rather depressed about the whole thing. But I think what we've heard are a lot of ideas. There are a lot of ideas, and there are still people of energy around who are trying to change things. And it sounds to me like it's the sort of thing that we just have to keep plugging away at. It's a long haul, but we can hopefully make things better over time. Anyway, thank you all very much for coming along.